The air in the Joint Operations Center carried the weight of compressed oxygen and purpose. Holographic tactical displays floated above the central dais, sapphire and emerald light painting transient shadows across the faces of assembled officers. The Strait of Hormuz shimmered in 3 dimensions, a digital representation of one of the world's most volatile choke points. Commercial shipping lanes traced predictable patterns through the water, their transponder signals forming a steady pulse of global commerce. Commander Evelyn Kincaid stood at parade rest before the central display, her posture so still she might have been carved from the same steel that formed the bulkheads around her. She was 40 years old, though her dark hair, pulled back in a regulation bun, so severe it seemed architectural, showed no gray. Her face possessed the kind of symmetry that others might have called beautiful, but it was a beauty rendered irrelevant by absolute focus. Her eyes, dark and unblinking, tracked a ghost signature threading through the commercial noise. It was a whisper in a thunderstorm, a pattern so faint that the system's artificial intelligence had flagged it as probable error and moved on. But Evelyn Kincaid did not move on. She had spent 2 decades learning to hear what others dismissed as silence. The pattern was there, a polymorphic frequency-hopping signature, its latency shifting in microsecond intervals that should have been random but weren't. The periodicity was too consistent, too deliberate. It was machine-driven, which meant it was intentional, which meant it was a threat. She adjusted the tactical overlay with a gesture, isolating the signal from the background radiation of 100 merchant vessels. The hologram responded, pulling the thread of data into sharp relief. There, Grid Square 79er. The signature pulsed with mechanical regularity, a heartbeat preparing to accelerate into attack rhythm. Report, the voice cut through the low hum of cooling fans and distant server clusters. It was not a request, it was an announcement, aimed at the room but directed nowhere in particular. Brigadier General Marcus Brennan had entered the operations center with the confidence of a man who believed his presence was itself a form of communication. He was 58 years old and built like consequence, his dress uniform straining slightly at the shoulders in a way that suggested he still thought of his body as a weapon. His face was broad and weathered, the kind of face that had stared down enemies across hostile terrain and believed that staring was sufficient. He moved on to the dais with proprietary authority, his eyes scanning the room for the senior naval officer present. They found Admiral William Vance seated in the elevated command chair, watching the proceedings with the patience of deep water. Vance was 62, lean where Brennan was broad, his gray hair cut close to his skull in a style that had not changed in 40 years. He did not move when Brennan entered. He simply observed. A junior lieutenant, his voice still carrying the Type A anxiety of recent academy graduation, began the brief. Sir, we are tracking anomalous electronic warfare signatures emanating from Grid Square 79er. Pattern analysis suggests a polymorphic frequency-hopping array, possibly land-based in origin. The signature does not match any known commercial. Polymorphic. Brennan's interruption was a bark, a sound like stone grinding against stone. He stepped closer to the display, his shadow falling across the hologram. Son, that's ghosting from the commercial channels. I've seen it 100 times in 3 theaters of operation. It's noise. Background radiation. Get me a real target, something that bleeds. The room held its breath. The lieutenant's mouth opened, then closed. He looked toward Commander Kincaid, who had not moved, had not even shifted her weight. She remained fixed on the display, her attention absolute. Then, without turning her head, without any preamble or deference, she spoke. General. Her voice was quiet, but it carried through the operations center with the clarity of a tuning fork struck in a silent room. With respect, the latency between frequency hops is too consistent for commercial reflection. The periodicity is machine-driven, not environmental. It is not noise. It is a targeting system preparing a firing solution. The silence that followed was not empty. It was full of recalculation, of social equations being rapidly rewritten. Every officer in the room understood what had just occurred. A commander had contradicted a general. In front of witnesses, in front of the admiral. Marcus Brennan's head swiveled slowly, his eyes landing on Evelyn Kincaid for what might have been the first time. He saw a woman of medium height, her dark hair severe, her working uniform immaculate. He saw the silver oak leaf on her collar, but his mind registered it as an administrative detail, not a mark of command authority. He saw her stillness, but his interpretation was not discipline. It was timidity, uncertainty, fear wearing the mask of competence. He walked toward her, his boots loud on the polished deck plating. Each step was a claim of territory, a reassertion of hierarchy through physical presence. He stopped close enough that she would have to tilt her head back to maintain eye contact if she chose to look at him. She did not. Her gaze remained fixed on the holographic display, on the signal that everyone else had decided to ignore. "Commander." His voice had shifted registers, dropping into a tone that was somehow more dangerous for its false gentleness. It was the voice of a man explaining something to a child. "In my Marine Corps, we don't chase shadows. We identify tangible threats. We put steel on target. We don't get distracted by static and electromagnetic ghosts that exist only in the computers." He gestured toward the display with one hand, and in that hand was a glass of ice water he had picked up from the briefing table. Condensation ran down its sides. Ice cubes shifted with a faint clink. Evelyn Kincaid's expression remained unchanged. She met his gaze directly for the first time, and her eyes were flat, unreadable. "General, the threat is tangible. The signal is the precursor. It is the whisper before the scream. If we wait for visual confirmation of a launch platform, we will be responding to an attack already in progress." Marcus Brennan's face tightened. He had expected deference. He had expected her to back down, to soften her assessment, to acknowledge that perhaps she had been overly cautious. Instead, she had doubled down. She had, in his interpretation, challenged him again, in front of his men, in front of the admiral, in front of junior officers who needed to understand how the chain of command functioned in the real world, not in some academic fantasy of meritocracy. He needed to reassert dominance. In his world, that required a demonstration, a spectacle. "Let me cool you down, Commander." His voice was a low sneer, intimate and cruel. "You seem a little overheated." What happened next occurred with the deliberate precision of theater. Marcus Brennan inverted the glass of ice water. Ice-cold liquid cascaded over Evelyn Kincaid's head in a single, unbroken stream. It soaked the collar of her Navy working uniform, darkening the fabric instantly. Water ran down her face, dripping from her chin onto the pristine floor of the operations center. Ice cubes clattered at her feet, spinning across the deck plating with small, sharp sounds that seemed impossibly loud in the shocked silence. A junior officer gasped. Another looked away, his face a mixture of embarrassment and disbelief. Major Blake Sutherland, one of Brennan's staff officers, stood frozen, his expression caught between triumph and uncertainty. Admiral Vance's jaw set like granite, but he remained motionless, his eyes recording everything. Commander Evelyn Kincaid did not flinch. She did not wipe the water from her face. She did not raise her hands to her soaked uniform. She did not speak. She simply stood there, water dripping from her eyelashes, her posture unbroken. The only change was a slight narrowing of her eyes, a shift so subtle that most in the room missed it entirely, but it was there, a transition from passive observation to active recording. She was documenting. Her mind was cataloging the witnesses, the time displayed on the operations center chronometer, the exact words spoken. She was a sensor array, and the data was now stored in multiple redundant systems. She was not a victim experiencing humiliation. She was a professional documenting a breach of protocol, an assault under the Uniform Code of Military Justice, and a failure of leadership. The distinction was everything. Marcus Brennan placed the empty glass back on the briefing table with a loud click that echoed through the silent operations center. He smiled, the expression sharp and satisfied. "There," he gestured to her soaked uniform. "Clarity." He turned his back on her, addressing the room again as if the incident had been nothing more than a brief correction of course. "Now, let's get back to finding something that actually matters. Something that poses a real threat. Lieutenant, pull up the latest satellite imagery from the northern sector. I want to see what's actually happening, not what the computers think might be happening." Evelyn Kincaid remained at her post for exactly 30 seconds. Her presence was a silent rebuke, a dripping monument to what had just occurred. Water pooled at her feet. Her uniform clung to her skin, cold and heavy. She felt none of it. Or rather, she felt all of it, but emotion was a luxury she could not afford. Emotion was a corrupting variable in a complex equation. Anger was noise. Humiliation was a subjective interpretation. The events in the operations center were simply data points, an unprofessional act, a failure of leadership, a violation of Article 134 of the Uniform Code of Military Justice, conduct unbecoming an officer and a gentleman. The problem required a solution, not a reaction. She executed a precise about-face, her movements economical and exact. Then she walked out of the Joint Operations Center. The wet slap of her boots on the deck plating was the only sound that followed her departure. It was a rhythm, steady and unhurried. The sound of someone who knew exactly where she was going and why. She walked the length of the corridor connecting the operations center to the administrative wing. The chilled fabric of her uniform clung to her body, water still dripping in a slow, steady rhythm. Personnel she passed in the corridor averted their gazes, conversations dying mid-sentence. Whispers followed in her wake, speculation spreading like ripples across still water. Evelyn Kincaid ignored them all. Their reactions were predictable, their discomfort irrelevant. She had a procedure to follow. Her destination was a small, secure communications annex tucked behind the main server farm. The room was barely large enough for 3 workstations, its walls lined with fiber optic conduits in junction boxes. The air here was even colder than the operations center, smelling of ozone and the clean electricity of powerful computing systems. It was a space designed for classified work, for information that could not be transmitted through standard channels. She sat at a hardened terminal reserved for sensitive, compartmented information, the kind of system that kept logs of every keystroke, every file accessed, every second of user activity. Her fingers, still damp, moved across the keyboard with practiced economy. She opened a new file, a formal report. The form itself was standard, provided by the Judge Advocate General's Office for documenting violations of military conduct. But her input was anything but standard. She did not write of disrespect or hurt feelings. She did not describe her emotional state or her perception of General Brennan's motivations. She wrote with the sterile precision of an after-action report, the kind of document that would be admissible as evidence in a court-martial. Subject: Breach of Military Conduct, UCMJ. Article 134. Reporting Officer, Commander Evelyn Kincaid. Service number 755-91-2847. Subject of report, Brigadier General Marcus Brennan. Service number 411-63-8921. Time, 14:32 hours Zulu. Location, Joint Operations Center, Forward Operating Base, Archangel. Witnesses, see attached roster, JOC Watch Bill 1400 to 2200. Summary of events. At 14:32 Zulu, During an operational briefing concerning anomalous electronic warfare signatures in Grid Square 79er, Brigadier General Marcus Brennan disputed the tactical assessment provided by the reporting officer. Following a brief verbal exchange regarding the nature of the detected signal, Brigadier General Brennan deliberately poured a glass of ice water onto the reporting officer in the presence of Joint Operations Center staff and senior leadership. Verbatim quote from Brigadier General Brennan prior to action. "Let me cool you down, Commander. You seem a little overheated." Verbatim quote following action. "There, clarity." She paused, rereading the text. It was dry, factual, and irrefutable. There was no interpretation, no emotional coloring. It was a simple, declarative statement of observable events. She attached the JOC watch bill, a roster that included Admiral Vance and over 20 other officers and enlisted personnel who had been present. She digitally signed the report with her common access card, the timestamp locking the submission to 14:48 hours Zulu. 16 minutes after the incident, speed mattered. Documentation created before any official pressure could be applied carried more evidentiary weight than complaints filed days later, after stories had been coordinated and narratives established. But she did not route the report to the base Judge Advocate General's office. She did not send it to Admiral Vance's staff. She sent it directly to a secure digital records repository, a quiet archive maintained by Fleet Cyber Command. It was a system designed for intelligence reports and operational documentation, a place where files existed in permanent, unalterable form with full cryptographic verification of their timestamp and content. It was a digital flare, unseen for now, but ready to illuminate when needed. Proof, chain of custody. These were the foundations of institutional correction. She closed the terminal session, the screen returning to its locked state. Report filed. The first step of the procedure was complete. She had documented the initial contact. Now she would observe and wait for the system to either correct itself or present another variable requiring action. She stood and walked out of the annex. Her uniform was still damp, still cold against her skin. But inside, her system was calm. The noise had been filtered. The signal was clear. She did not return to her quarters. Instead, she took a path that led to the far perimeter of the base, to a squat, windowless building that hummed with the sound of powerful filtration pumps. The Naval Special Warfare Dive Training Facility. The air inside was thick with the smell of chlorine and neoprene, the chemical signature of a space dedicated to preparing bodies for underwater operations. Gear lockers lined one wall, their contents visible through wire mesh. Rebreathers, buoyancy compensators, dive computers, regulators arranged with military precision. Master Chief Robert Drummond stood near the equipment cage, his weathered hands performing routine maintenance on a closed-circuit rebreather. He was 55 years old, his face a topographical map of 3 decades in the SEAL teams. His hair was gray, cut close to his skull, and his eyes carried the particular alertness of men who had spent years operating in environments where inattention meant death. He looked up as Evelyn entered, his gaze taking in her still damp hair, the dark water stains on her uniform. His expression did not change. He simply nodded, a gesture of acknowledgement that contained no questions, no judgment. He knew her well enough to understand that her presence here was not about escape. It was about calibration. She signed out a rebreather and a set of weights from the equipment log, her handwriting precise. She changed into a dry suit in the adjacent locker room, the neoprene thick and confining in a way that others found claustrophobic, but that she experienced as a kind of armor. She checked the rebreather's systems with methodical attention, verifying gas mixtures, scrubber status, bailout procedures. In this environment, carelessness was not punished by embarrassment. It was punished by drowning. She entered the dive pool, a 20-foot deep tank of clear blue water used for emergency egress training and combat swimmer qualification. The initial shock of cold was a familiar embrace, a transition from one world to another. She descended slowly, her movements fluid and controlled. The pressure increased with each foot of depth, a comforting weight against her body that demanded respect for physics, not personalities. The world above, the noise, the politics, the egos, dissolved into a shimmering surface that became less distinct with each meter of descent. She settled on the bottom of the tank, the concrete floor solid beneath her. She crossed her legs in the lotus position, a posture that would have seemed absurd to anyone watching from above. But there was no one watching. She was alone in a world governed by absolute rules. Pressure, buoyancy, gas laws, thermodynamics. The water did not care about rank or reputation or gender. It demanded respect for its properties, for the unyielding laws that governed its behavior. Here, she recalibrated. She did not move. She simply existed, suspended in blue silence. The only sound was the rhythmic hiss and bubble of the rebreather, her own breathing translated into a mechanical whisper. In, out, in, out. A metronome marking time in an environment where time moved differently. She replayed the incident in the operations center, not as a memory laden with emotional weight, as a tactical problem. Marcus Brennan's actions were a probe, an attempt to find weakness. He had expected an emotional response. Tears, anger, a complaint filed through official channels that he could then paint as vindictive, as proof of an officer who couldn't handle the pressure of real-world operations. Any of those responses would have fit his pre-existing narrative, an oversensitive, hysterical female officer who lacked the temperament for command. Her lack of response had confused him. It was an anomaly in his data set, a result that did not match his predictive model. Men like Marcus Brennan operated on pattern recognition refined over decades. They knew how to dominate, how to intimidate, how to establish hierarchy through force of personality and physical presence. When their methods failed to produce expected results, they did not recalibrate. They doubled down. She knew with cold certainty that he would not let it go. His ego had been pricked by her quiet defiance, by her refusal to be broken or even visibly disturbed. He would interpret her silence and procedural response as weakness, as confirmation that he had won the initial engagement. He would need to press his advantage, to solidify his dominance before she had time to recover or organize resistance. The next confrontation would be more direct. He would seek to provoke the reaction he had failed to elicit the first time. He would escalate because escalation was the only tool he understood. She regulated her breathing, slowing her heart rate through conscious effort. She thought of the Phoenix emblem of her old unit, the specialized signals intelligence and cyber warfare group where she had spent 8 years before rotating to this forward operating base. The unit's motto had been Fides in Tenebris, faith in darkness. It was about finding signals in noise, about trusting the data when all sensory input suggested chaos. She was in darkness now, institutionally speaking, but she had faith in the procedure. She had laid the first stone of a foundation of proof. Marcus Brennan was operating on instinct and ego. She was operating on process and evidence. In the long term, process always defeated instinct. After 60 minutes suspended in the silent blue world, she began her ascent. She rose slowly, allowing her body to adjust to the changing pressure, her ascent rate controlled by training and discipline. As she broke the surface, the sounds of the world rushed back. The hum of filtration pumps, the distant clang of metal on metal from the equipment cage, the low murmur of ventilation systems. She felt centered again. The cold of the operations center incident had been replaced by a different kind of cold. The absolute, dispassionate clarity of a marksman preparing to engage a distant target. The variables were calculated. The environment was understood. She was ready for the next phase. She handed her gear back to Master Chief Drummond, who had continued his maintenance work, his presence a steady constant. He looked up as she approached, his eyes reading her face in a way that only decades of experience allowed. "All good, Commander?" His voice was a low rumble, the kind of voice that had called cadence for 1,000 runs, that had given orders in firefights and never needed to be repeated. "Affirmative, Master Chief." Her voice was level, calm. "Correction is in progress." He nodded, understanding more than her words conveyed. He simply began to service the rebreather she had returned, his movements practiced and sure. He knew a process had begun, and his role was to stay out of its way and be ready when needed. 2 days passed. The base operated under a tense, unspoken truce. Whispers followed Commander Evelyn Kincaid through every space she occupied. In the dining facility, conversations paused when she entered, resumed in hushed tones after she passed. Some looked at her with pity, the kind of patronizing sympathy reserved for victims who lacked the courage to fight back. Others looked at her with a veiled contempt that mirrored General Brennan's, their expressions suggesting she had somehow invited the humiliation, that her presence in a combat command structure was itself a provocation. Evelyn ignored them all. She ate her meals with the same focused intent she applied to analyzing a technical schematic. She sat alone, her movements economical, her attention never leaving her tray. To observers, she appeared isolated, perhaps even defeated. To anyone who understood her, she was simply processing information and waiting for the next data point. She continued her work without interruption. In the Signals Intelligence Analysis Wing, she spent hours reviewing electronic warfare patterns across the region. The polymorphic signature in Grid Square 79er had evolved, its periodicity shortening in a way that suggested the targeting system was entering final preparation stages. She updated her analysis, flagged it as critical priority, and submitted it through proper channels. The submission was blocked at the Marine Liaison Office. General Brennan's staff had implemented new review procedures for all intelligence assessments originating from Commander Kincaid's section. The justification was standardization and quality control. The reality was suppression. Evelyn noted the blockage, documented it in her personal logs, and continued her analysis. The pattern would either manifest as a threat or it wouldn't. Her job was to identify it. Whether the institution chose to act on her identification was beyond her control. On the morning of the third day, Captain Theodore Whitmore sat down across from her in the dining facility. He was 45 years old, Admiral Vance's flag aide, a navigator by training who understood that the straightest course was not always the best one. He carried a tray but did not eat, his hands folded on the table, his expression careful. "The Admiral knows what happened, Evelyn." He kept his voice low, barely audible over the ambient noise of the dining facility. "He's observing." Observation is a valid tactical choice. Evelyn did not look up from her meal. Her tone was conversational, as if they were discussing weather patterns or equipment maintenance schedules. Whitmore's frustration was visible in the tightness around his eyes. "Brennan is spinning it. He's telling everyone he was just joking around, trying to loosen up a high-strung officer. He's painting you as fragile, unable to handle the pressure." The perception of the opposition is a valuable intelligence asset. Evelyn finally met his eyes, her gaze steady and devoid of the anger he expected to see. "It reveals their strategy." "Their strategy," Whitmore said, his voice tight, "is to have you transferred off this base before the next operational cycle begins." He's already put in a formal request to the Admiral. He's citing lack of command temperament on your part, inability to integrate with the Marine element of the command structure. This was the escalation she had predicted. A formal accusation, bureaucratically processed. A move to remove her from the board entirely, to ensure she could not continue challenging his authority or his judgment. It was predictable. It was also documentable. Evelyn took a slow sip of water. "His request will require supporting documentation." "He's manufacturing it." Whitmore leaned forward slightly. He's having his staff officers write statements about your uncooperative nature, your rigid approach to command relationships, your inability to accept constructive criticism. He's building a case. Evelyn placed her fork down with precise care. Thank you for the information, Theo. Her tone was calm, final. The conversation was over. She had the data she needed. Whitmore recognized the dismissal and stood, his expression a mixture of concern and confusion. He wanted her to be angry, to be planning counterattacks, to be engaged in the political warfare that men like Brennan understood. Her absolute calm unnerved him more than rage would have. The provocation came that evening. Evelyn was in a quiet corridor that connected the command suites to the Signals Intelligence Analysis Wing. It was a narrow passage, lined with secure conduits and junction boxes, lit by the pale blue glow of LED strips. She was reviewing thermal imaging data from a reconnaissance drone on a hardened tablet, her focus absolute. The corridor was ideal for her work. It was seldom used during evening hours, quiet enough that she could concentrate without interruption. It was also narrow, with only one entrance and one exit, a detail she noted without emphasis, the way she noted all environmental factors. Brigadier General Marcus Brennan appeared at the far end of the corridor. He was not alone. Major Blake Sutherland and Captain Ian McAllister flanked him, two staff officers whose primary function seemed to be reflecting their general's opinions back to him with appropriate enthusiasm. They moved as a unit, filling the narrow space, blocking the exit behind them. It was a classic intimidation tactic. Overwhelm with physical presence, cut off escape routes, force confrontation in an environment where the target feels trapped. Brennan wore his dress uniform, the ribbons on his chest a catalog of deployments and commendations. He had a self-satisfied expression, the look of a man who believed he had already won and was simply here to accept the surrender. Commander Kincaid, his voice boomed in the confined space, echoing off the bulkheads. Just the officer I wanted to see. We need to have a little chat about your performance evaluation. Evelyn did not look up from her tablet. This is not the appropriate time or place for that discussion, General. Oh, I think it is. Brennan stepped closer, Sutherland and McAllister fanning out slightly in a practiced, menacing posture. You see, I'm concerned about your attitude. It's rigid, inflexible. You don't seem to be a team player, Commander. That's a problem in a joint operational environment. He was now standing directly in front of her, his shadow falling across the tablet, blocking the pale light from the overhead strips. Still, she did not look up. My function is to provide accurate signals intelligence analysis. That function is unimpaired. Brennan's smirk faltered. This was not the reaction he wanted. He needed fear or anger. He needed a scene he could use. Witnesses who would later testify to her emotional instability, her inability to handle criticism, her unsuitability for command. He reached down and snatched the tablet from her hands. Your function, Commander, is to do what you're told and to show the proper respect. Evelyn slowly raised her head. Her eyes were flat, her expression unreadable. When she spoke, her voice was quiet, but carried absolute clarity. Return the government property, General. Marcus Brennan held the tablet just out of her reach, his smirk returning with renewed confidence. Or what? His voice dropped to a sneer, intimate and mocking. You'll run to the Admiral? You had your chance for that, Commander. You did nothing. That's because you know your place. He took another step forward, closing the distance between them to mere inches. His bulk filled her field of vision, a deliberate invasion of personal space designed to make her feel small, trapped, overwhelmed. The two officers behind him shifted their weight, ready to witness whatever came next. You know what you are? Brennan's voice became a conspiratorial whisper, meant only for her but loud enough that Sutherland and McAllister could hear. You're just a diversity hire, a box checker. You don't belong here. You don't have what it takes for real operations. You're a staff officer playing at being a warrior, and everyone knows it. Each word was chosen for maximum impact, designed to provoke the emotional breakdown he had failed to achieve in the operations center. He needed her to cry, to shout, to physically push him away. Any of those reactions would serve his purposes, would fit the narrative he was constructing of an unstable female officer who cracked under the pressure of masculine command culture. This is your last chance to understand how things work in the real world, Brennan continued, still holding the tablet above her reach like a schoolyard bully. You can transfer quietly, take a nice, safe staff position somewhere, or you can keep pushing and find out what happens to officers who don't know when to fold. Evelyn Kincaid's expression remained unchanged. No anger flashed in her eyes. No fear registered in her posture. She simply stood there, her gaze level, waiting. Then Marcus Brennan made his final mistake. He reached out with his free hand, intending to grab her arm. It was meant to be the ultimate assertion of physical dominance, the kind of contact that would either make her flinch away or give him grounds to claim she had struck him when he was simply trying to guide her out of the corridor for a private conversation. His fingers were already forming the grip, his mind already writing the report he would file. The moment his fingertips brushed the fabric of her uniform sleeve, the world shifted on its axis. What happened next occurred in less time than it took for Blake Sutherland and Ian McAllister to process that movement had begun. It was not a fight. There was no exchange of blows, no grappling, no struggle. It was a physics problem being solved with surgical precision. Evelyn did not strike Marcus Brennan. She moved with him. As his hand closed on her arm, she pivoted on the ball of her left foot, a movement so fluid it seemed choreographed. Her right hand came up, not in a block, but as a guide, cupping his elbow with fingers that applied pressure to specific points. It was a controlled joint lock, non-injurious but completely disorienting, amplifying his sense that his body was no longer responding to his commands. His own forward momentum, the aggressive closing of distance that he had initiated, became a liability. His center of gravity shifted forward, his weight committed to a grab that was no longer happening where he expected it to be. Evelyn's pivot redirected that momentum, using his mass and velocity against him. 230 pounds of muscle and ego became a projectile with a trajectory he had not chosen. Blake Sutherland and Ian McAllister watched in stunned paralysis as their commanding general, a man they had seen dominate physical confrontations through sheer intimidating presence, suddenly became horizontal in midair. Their brains struggled to catch up with their eyes. One moment the general had been reaching for the commander. The next moment he was falling, his body completely out of his control, his face registering confusion that had not yet evolved into fear. Just before Marcus Brennan's face would have impacted the steel bulkhead, Evelyn completed her pivot. She released the joint lock, her hands moving to his torso and head in a motion that was not aggression but aftercare. She cushioned the impact, redirecting his trajectory, but the fundamental physics were unalterable. His heavy body, now completely horizontal and accelerating toward the deck, could not be stopped. The impact was thunderous. Marcus Brennan's body slammed into the deck plating with a wet, heavy sound that reverberated through the corridor. Metal rang like a bell struck with a mallet. His head bounced once against the deck, his eyes rolling back, showing white. He was unconscious before his body stopped moving, his nervous system shutting down in response to the sudden trauma, his brain briefly offline as it tried to process what had just occurred. The entire sequence, from the moment his fingers touched her sleeve to the moment he lay motionless on the deck, had taken less than 3 seconds. Evelyn Kincaid immediately knelt beside him. Her hands went to his neck with practiced efficiency, fingers finding the carotid pulse, strong and regular. She tilted his head back slightly, ensuring his airway was clear, checking that his tongue had not blocked his breathing. Her movements were clinical, the practiced motions of a combat lifesaver who had been trained to provide emergency care in hostile environments. She was no longer an opponent, she was a first responder. The threat had been neutralized. Now the priority was ensuring the subject survived without permanent injury. Blake Sutherland and Ian McAllister stood frozen, their mouths slightly open, their eyes wide with an emotion somewhere between shock and dawning horror. They had come to this corridor to watch a general dress down an insubordinate officer. They had expected to witness a demonstration of authority, perhaps even to participate in the intimidation. Instead, they had just watched their commanding officer, a man they considered the apex of military masculinity, rendered unconscious in under 3 seconds by the quiet, unassuming commander he had been systematically tormenting. Evelyn looked up at them, her expression as calm as it had been in the operations center when water was dripping from her face. Her voice, when she spoke, carried the same flat authority it always did. "He's breathing, pulse is steady. He will require a medical evaluation for possible concussion." She paused, her gaze moving from one frozen officer to the other. "One of you will call for a corpsman immediately. The other will secure this corridor. This is now a potential incident site. Do you understand your instructions?" Her voice, devoid of triumph or panic or any emotion whatsoever, broke through their paralysis. Captain McAllister fumbled for his radio, his hands shaking slightly as he keyed the emergency medical frequency. Major Sutherland simply stared at Evelyn, a new and terrifying understanding dawning in his eyes. He was seeing her for the first time, not as a woman, not as a staff officer, not as a diversity hire or a box checker, or any of the dismissive categories they had used to diminish her. He was seeing her as a force governed by rules he could not begin to comprehend, a system that operated according to principles he had never encountered. She had not attacked, she had responded. She had used minimal force to neutralize an assault. She had immediately rendered medical aid. She had secured the scene and ensured proper procedures were followed. Every action she had taken would be defensible, justifiable, documented. They had all been so focused on her silence, her stillness, her refusal to engage in emotional displays, that they had mistaken restraint for weakness. They had watched a high-performance engine idling and concluded it had no power. They had just watched her redline. Captain Theodore Whitmore was the first command-level officer to arrive at the scene, followed closely by 2 master-at-arms with sidearms holstered but hands ready. He found Commander Kincaid standing calmly beside General Brennan's still unconscious form, her tablet back in her hand as if nothing unusual had occurred. Blake Sutherland and Ian McAllister were giving stammering, contradictory statements to the security personnel, their stories already diverging in the way that eyewitness accounts always diverged when minds were trying to process events that contradicted expectations. "Evelyn," Whitmore's voice was tight with a mixture of concern and professional alarm. He looked from her composed face to the hulking form of the general on the deck, taking in the scene with the practiced eye of someone who understood that what he was seeing would have consequences that rippled far beyond this narrow corridor. "There was an incident, Captain." Evelyn's voice was level, her report delivered with the same precision she would use to brief tactical intelligence. Brigadier General Brennan initiated unwanted physical contact. I responded with minimal, non-lethal force to neutralize the immediate threat. He lost consciousness due to the subsequent fall. I have rendered first aid and secured the scene. I recommend that all parties present be formally interviewed and that all security camera footage from this corridor be preserved as evidence. Whitmore looked from her placid expression to the general on the floor, noting the almost surgical precision of the situation. There was no rage here, no loss of control, no heat of the moment. This was the result of a calculated response to a specific threat. The medical team arrived with a stretcher, their movements efficient as they began their assessment of the unconscious general. "Understood, Commander," Whitmore said. his tone shifting from personal concern to professional duty. He turned to the master-at-arms. "Secure this entire corridor. No one enters or exits. Get statements from everyone present. Commander Kincaid, you'll need to come with me." As they walked away, the medical team loading Marcus Brennan onto a stretcher, the whispers had already begun to change. The narrative of the fragile commander was evaporating like morning fog under direct sunlight, replaced by a confused and fearful murmur. They had all misjudged her. They had mistaken the quiet hum of absolute competence for silence. They had mistaken discipline for passivity. They had just witnessed what happened when that illusion shattered. An official investigation was mandated within the hour by the simple fact that a general officer had been rendered unconscious by a subordinate. The circumstances were initially irrelevant to procedural requirements. An incident had occurred. Documentation was required. Statements would be taken. Evidence would be gathered. The machine of military justice, ponderous and bureaucratic, began its inexorable process. Marcus Brennan regained consciousness 20 minutes after being transported to the base medical facility. The attending physician, a Navy commander with 2 decades of emergency medicine experience, diagnosed a mild concussion, some soft tissue bruising, and what the physician privately considered a significantly bruised ego. Brennan's first words upon regaining awareness were a demand to know where Commander Kincaid was, and a statement that she would be court-martialed before sunset. The physician, with the particular authority that medical personnel possess when dealing with patients, regardless of rank, informed the general that he would be remaining under observation for at least 6 hours, and that he was in no condition to be making official statements or filing charges. Brennan predictably ignored this medical advice and immediately summoned Blake Sutherland and Ian McAllister to his bedside. What followed was a coordinated construction of narrative, a work of fiction crafted with a specific purpose of destroying Evelyn Kincaid's career and protecting Marcus Brennan's reputation. The 3 men, working from a shared understanding of what needed to be true rather than what had actually occurred, filed sworn statements with the base Judge Advocate General's office. According to their version of events, Commander Kincaid had been behaving erratically for days, becoming increasingly hostile and insubordinate. When General Brennan had attempted to counsel her privately in the corridor, offering constructive guidance on how to improve her professional relationships and command presence, she had snapped without warning. She had screamed incoherently about disrespect and discrimination. She had attacked the general with shocking violence, using some kind of martial arts technique to strike him before he could defend himself. The attack had been unprovoked, vicious, and indicative of severe emotional instability that made her unsuitable for operational command. They were counting on several factors working in their favor: the institutional weight of a general's word against a commander, the ingrained cultural bias that would find their dramatic version of events more plausible than any alternative, the assumption that a woman who had been publicly humiliated days earlier might indeed have reached a breaking point, and the simple fact that people generally believe stories that confirm their existing worldviews about women in combat commands. Evelyn Kincaid was temporarily relieved of her duties, pending the outcome of the investigation. She was confined to her quarters, with restrictions on her movement around the base, except for necessary activities like meals and mandated interviews with investigators. She did not protest the restrictions. She did not attempt to contact Admiral Vance or any other senior officer who might intervene on her behalf. She complied with every order, answered every question put to her by the investigators with the same precise, emotionless clarity she brought to every professional task. Her statement to the investigating officers was a marvel of brevity and precision. It was nearly identical to the verbal report she had given Captain Whitmore in the corridor immediately after the incident. It contained no emotion, no speculation about General Brennan's motivations, no appeals to sympathy or justice. It was simply a sequence of events described in the language of physics and military procedure. At approximately 1820 hours, I was in Corridor C7, reviewing intelligence data on a government-issued tablet, when General Brennan approached with two staff officers, Major Blake Sutherland and Captain Ian McAllister. General Brennan blocked my egress from the corridor and demanded an immediate discussion regarding my performance evaluation. When I indicated this was neither the appropriate time nor place for such a discussion, he confiscated the tablet from my possession. When I requested the return of government property, he initiated unwanted physical contact by attempting to grab my arm. I responded with a minimal force joint manipulation technique designed to neutralize the immediate threat without causing permanent injury to the subject. The subject lost balance due to his own forward momentum and fell, striking his head on the deck plating. I immediately rendered first aid, ensured his airway was clear and pulse was stable, and summoned medical response while securing the incident site. The investigators, Navy Captain Patricia Morgan and Marine Colonel James Wade, were openly skeptical of Evelyn's account. The story presented by General Brennan was dramatic, emotional, and fit established patterns of behavior they had seen in other cases involving officers who had broken under operational stress. It was a narrative about the unfortunate reality that not everyone possessed the psychological resilience required for the demands of forward-deployed operations in high-stress environments. Evelyn Kincaid's statement, by contrast, was cold, clinical, almost robotic in its detachment. To their minds, trained to recognize emotional authenticity as a marker of truth, it was suspiciously flat, the kind of carefully prepared statement someone might craft if they were trying to hide their true emotional state or construct a legal defense after the fact. The fact that she admitted to using physical force against a superior officer, even while claiming it was defensive in nature, seemed to them a de facto admission of assault. Captain Morgan and Colonel Wade were experienced investigators. They had seen officers lie before. They had developed instincts about credibility that went beyond written statements. General Brennan's anger, his wounded pride, his insistence on justice, these felt authentic to them. Commander Kincaid's absolute calm in the face of career-ending allegations felt wrong, artificial, perhaps even sociopathic. They did not yet understand that they were measuring her by a standard that did not apply. They were looking for emotional markers that Evelyn Kincaid had trained herself to suppress over 2 decades of military service. They were mistaking professional discipline for psychological abnormality. On the afternoon of the 3rd day of the investigation, while Evelyn remained confined to quarters and General Brennan recovered in his own quarters under continuing medical observation, a different sequence of events was unfolding 200 miles away from Forward Operating Base Archangel. A special operations team, operating on intelligence that had been flagged as critical priority 4 days earlier, had located a concealed mobile missile battery in the mountainous terrain north of the Strait of Hormuz. The battery consisted of 4 truck-mounted launchers, each equipped with advanced anti-ship cruise missiles of Russian design. The targeting systems were active, their polymorphic frequency-hopping signatures exactly matching the pattern Commander Evelyn Kincaid had identified in Grid Square 79er. The missiles were armed. Fire control radars were actively painting the USS Theodore Roosevelt, a Nimitz-class aircraft carrier operating in international waters, with a crew complement of over 5,000 sailors. The Special Operations Team, working in close coordination with Air Force strike assets, providing overhead surveillance and precision fire support, neutralized the battery 17 minutes before the calculated launch window would have opened. The attack, had it succeeded, would have resulted in catastrophic loss of life and potentially sparked a wider regional conflict with implications that extended far beyond the immediate tactical situation. The carrier strike group had been completely unaware of the specific threat. Their own electronic warfare systems had been filtering the polymorphic signal as commercial noise, exactly as General Brennan had predicted it would be. The intelligence that had led to the deployment of the Special Operations Team, that had provided the precise geographic coordinates and the operational timeline, had come from a single source. An analysis filed 4 days earlier by Commander Evelyn Kincaid, who had identified the polymorphic frequency hopping pattern in Grid Square 79er and assessed it with high confidence as a targeting system in final preparation stages for a firing solution. The analysis that Brigadier General Marcus Brennan had dismissed as shadow chasing. The analysis that had been blocked from distribution by Brennan's staff. The analysis that had precipitated the water incident in the operations center. Admiral William Vance received the after-action report while sitting in his office, reviewing the preliminary investigation findings from Captain Morgan and Colonel Wade. He read the operational report twice, his expression unchanging, his eyes moving across the text with the methodical attention of someone who understood that details mattered. Then he set the report aside, folded his hands on his desk, and sat in silence for several minutes, thinking. Then he summoned Captain Whitmore and requested that all materials related to the Kincaid investigation be brought to him immediately, along with any relevant operational intelligence from the past week. On the morning of the 6th day, Admiral Vance called Captain Morgan and Colonel Wade to his office. The space was austere, decorated only with a few photographs of ships and a tactical map of the Persian Gulf region. Vance sat behind his desk, his hands folded, his gray eyes unblinking and patient. Captain Whitmore stood quietly by the viewport, looking out at the morning sun reflecting off the distant water. "What have you found?" Vance's voice was a low baritone that seemed to fill the room despite its quiet volume. Captain Morgan cleared her throat, glancing at Colonel Wade before responding. "Sir, the sworn testimony from General Brennan and his staff officers is internally consistent and detailed. They paint a clear picture of an unprovoked assault by an officer who had been under increasing stress. Commander Kincaid's statement is unusual, Admiral. It's clinical, almost robotic in its detachment. Frankly, sir, it lacks the emotional authenticity we would expect from a truthful account. She admits to using physical force against a superior officer, which corroborates the core element of the assault charge. Credibility," Vance repeated the word as if testing its weight and finding it wanting. "An interesting concept, Captain. Tell me, in your professional assessment, does objective evidence matter more than emotional credibility? Or does the narrative that feels emotionally satisfying to our preconceptions carry more weight in determining truth?" Morgan stiffened slightly, recognizing the implicit criticism. "Evidence is paramount, sir, but the only objective evidence beyond the sworn testimony is the security camera footage from the corridor. And that footage is problematic for both versions of events." "Problematic," Vance echoed, his tone neutral. "Show me this problematic evidence." Captain Whitmore moved to the console mounted in the wall, entering commands that brought the large display screen to life. The security footage appeared, time-stamped and labeled, showing Corridor C7 from a high-angle camera mounted near the ceiling junction. The video quality was excellent, the resolution sufficient to capture facial expressions and body language. It showed Commander Kincaid standing in the corridor, tablet in hand, her attention focused on the screen. It showed General Brennan approaching from the far end of the corridor, flanked by Major Sutherland and Captain McAllister. The three men formed a wall of physical presence, blocking her only exit. The audio was faint, nearly inaudible, but the body language required no sound to interpret. Brennan's posture was aggressive, his movements those of someone claiming territory and establishing dominance. He invaded Kincaid's personal space, his bulk dwarfing her smaller frame, in a display of physical intimidation that was textbook harassment. He gesticulated with one hand, his expression contemptuous, while the other hand reached out and snatched the tablet from her grasp. The movement was sharp, aggressive, designed to humiliate and establish control. Then came the moment of physical contact. Brennan reached for Kincaid's arm, his intention clear even in the silent footage. His hand was forming a grip, his body weight already shifting forward to reinforce the grab. What happened next unfolded so quickly that Captain Morgan actually asked Whitmore to replay it at quarter speed. Even slowed down significantly, the movement was elegant in its economy. Kincaid pivoted, her body moving with Brennan's momentum rather than against it. There was no strike, no punch, no violent collision. It was a redirection, as fluid as water flowing around an obstacle. Brennan's own forward motion, his own aggression and mass, became the source of his downfall. His weight and momentum betrayed him, physics unforgiving of poor tactical choices. He fell not from being attacked, but from being expertly outmaneuvered, his body horizontal before his conscious mind understood what was happening. The footage showed Kincaid immediately kneeling to check on him, her hands moving to his neck and head in the practiced motions of combat medical response, ensuring his airway was clear and his pulse was stable. The timestamps showed that less than 3 seconds had elapsed from the moment of contact to the moment of impact. 3 seconds from assault initiation to threat neutralization to medical response. Captain Morgan and Colonel Wade watched the replay in absolute silence. Their expressions slowly changed from professional skepticism to something else, disbelief. Then, reluctantly and uncomfortably, understanding. The footage did not show a hysterical woman snapping under accumulated stress. It showed a trained professional responding to a physical assault with precisely calibrated defensive force. It showed a textbook response to an aggressive superior using position, rank, and physical presence to intimidate and ultimately assault a subordinate officer. Every movement Kincaid had made was defensible under military law and rules of engagement. Every action was justified and proportional. Her statement, the cold, clinical statement they had dismissed as lacking emotional authenticity, matched the video evidence with perfect accuracy. General Brennan's dramatic narrative, the compelling story of being ambushed by a screaming, violent officer who had lost control, was completely and utterly contradicted by objective evidence. That gentleman, Admiral Vance said into the stunned silence that followed the replay, is what actual credibility looks like when it correlates with objective fact rather than subjective emotional performance. He turned to Captain Whitmore, who stood ready by the console. "David, is there additional material the investigators should review?" "Yes, Admiral." Whitmore brought up another file on the screen. This document had a different timestamp, a different classification marking, a different routing path. It was a formal report filed with Fleet Cyber Command's Secure Records Repository rather than through normal command channels. The report detailed an incident in the Joint Operations Center. Water poured deliberately onto an officer by a superior during an operational briefing. Verbatim quotes preserved with legal precision. A comprehensive witness list including over 20 names. A timestamp showing it had been filed at 14:48 Zulu, exactly 16 minutes after the incident occurred. 2 full days before the corridor confrontation that had resulted in General Brennan's unconsciousness. Captain Morgan read the document, her face visibly losing color as the implications became clear. Colonel Wade leaned forward, his eyes scanning the text with increasing focus and growing comprehension of what he was seeing. They both understood immediately what they were looking at and what it meant for their investigation. "She documented the first incident before the second one even happened," Morgan said quietly, almost to herself, her voice carrying a note of professional admiration mixed with personal discomfort at how badly she had misjudged the situation. She established a documented pattern of harassment and escalating assault. She created an unbreakable chain of custody for evidence of misconduct, Vance said, his voice taking on an edge of cold steel that reminded everyone in the room why he held flag rank. She did not escalate the situation. She did not file a complaint with the Judge Advocate General seeking immediate intervention. She did not come to me or any other senior officer requesting protection or redress. She documented with legal precision. She created a permanent, time-stamped, cryptographically verified record in a secure system that cannot be altered or deleted. Then, when physically assaulted days later, she responded with a degree of force so precisely calibrated as to be, in my professional assessment, a masterwork of tactical decision-making under pressure. She protected herself while simultaneously ensuring that General Brennan was not permanently injured, despite having every legal and moral justification to use more severe force. She immediately rendered medical aid to her attacker. She secured the scene and ensured proper investigative procedures were followed. He stood, his full height and the accumulated weight of his rank and experience filling the office with an authority that required no volume or dramatic gestures. She did everything right, everything. Every single action she took was legally defensible, tactically sound, and procedurally correct. While we, and I include myself in this assessment, were prepared to believe that a dramatic, emotional story told by a general officer with 30 years of service must be more credible than a factual, dispassionate account from a commander. We were prepared to believe this despite the fact that Commander Kincaid's operational track record is exemplary, her technical expertise is unquestioned, and her professional conduct has been beyond reproach throughout her career. Colonel Wade looked from the screen to the Admiral, his expression that of a man whose fundamental assumptions about a case had just been completely overturned. "Sir, this evidence changes the entire scope and direction of the investigation." "No, Colonel," Vance corrected him with precision, his tone gentler but no less firm. "It does not change the scope. It concludes the investigation. You now have your objective evidence. Documented, time-stamped, video recorded, irrefutable evidence of what actually occurred. I expect your final report on my desk by 1800 hours today. A report that reflects the truth demonstrated by the evidence on that screen, not the emotionally satisfying fiction told by a man whose ego has been writing checks his conduct and character cannot possibly cash." The two investigators came to attention simultaneously. "Yes, sir," they said in unison, their voices subdued, professional pride wounded by how thoroughly they had been misled by their own biases and assumptions. As they left the office, Admiral Vance remained standing, looking out the viewport at the base spread below him, at the personnel moving with purpose between buildings, at the orderly functioning of military operations that depended ultimately on trust and integrity. Captain Whitmore waited in respectful silence, understanding that the Admiral was processing not just this specific case, but its broader implications for command culture. "The signal was there from the very beginning," Vance said quietly, speaking more to himself than to Whitmore, but not excluding him from the reflection. "She tried to tell us about the missile threat. She provided a clear, professionally competent assessment based on solid technical analysis. Brennan dismissed it as noise, as shadow chasing, as the overreaction of an overcautious officer. She was right. Her analysis, the analysis he publicly humiliated her for presenting, just saved over 5,000 lives on the Roosevelt. And while she was being proved absolutely correct in her professional judgment, she was simultaneously being destroyed personally and professionally by a man who couldn't tolerate being contradicted by a subordinate, especially a female subordinate. "What happens now, sir?" Whitmore asked, though he suspected he already knew the answer. Vance turned from the window, his expression hard with resolve. "Now we correct course. Now we remind this command what actual leadership looks like, as opposed to the toxic parody of leadership that General Brennan has been demonstrating. And now General Brennan learns, publicly and permanently, that there are severe consequences for mistaking professional restraint for weakness, for mistaking discipline for timidity, for mistaking silence for absence of power. The formal hearing was convened at precisely 1000 hours on the seventh day following the corridor incident. The venue was the main briefing theater, a space normally reserved for strategic planning sessions and high-level operational briefings involving classified information. The room could accommodate 200 people in tiered seating that descended toward a central floor space where presentations were normally delivered to senior leadership. Today, that floor space had been converted into something resembling a courtroom, though this was not a court-martial proceeding. It was an Article 15 non-judicial punishment hearing, an administrative proceeding that carried the full weight of military discipline without the formal legal procedures of a court. Admiral William Vance had made attendance mandatory for this hearing. Not suggested, not encouraged, not strongly recommended, mandatory. Every officer on Forward Operating Base Archangel, regardless of branch of service or current assignment or rank, had received direct orders to be present. The theater was filled beyond normal capacity, sailors and Marines sitting shoulder to shoulder in an uncomfortable mixture of services that rarely congregated in such numbers for any purpose. The air hummed with whispered speculation and nervous energy. Everyone knew something significant was about to occur, but the rumors had been so contradictory over the past week that no one was certain exactly what they would witness. Commander Evelyn Kincaid sat at a small table positioned to the left of the central floor space. She wore her service dress white uniform, the fabric crisp and immaculate as if freshly pressed that morning. Her ribbons aligned with micrometer precision, each decoration placed exactly where regulations specified. Her dark hair was pulled back in the same severe regulation bun she always wore, not a single strand out of place, despite the week of confinement and investigation. A judge advocate general officer sat beside her, a lieutenant commander whose role was largely ceremonial at this point. Evelyn's evidence had already done all the talking that needed to be done. Her face betrayed nothing, no anxiety about the outcome, no anticipation of vindication, no satisfaction at impending justice. She simply sat with perfect military posture, her hands folded on the table before her in a position of neutral readiness, her gaze directed forward at nothing in particular. To anyone who had observed her over the past week, her demeanor was identical to what it had been in the dining facility, in the operations center, in every public space where she had been seen. Absolute composure, impenetrable calm, the eye of a hurricane that raged around her but never touched her center. At another table positioned to the right of the floor space in a mirror arrangement sat Brigadier General Marcus Brennan. His face was a thundercloud of barely contained rage, his jaw set so tight that the muscles jumped visibly beneath his skin every few seconds. He wore his dress uniform as well, the ribbons and badges of a 30-year career displayed prominently across his chest, a catalog of deployments and commendations that he believed should insulate him from the consequences of his actions. Behind him sat Major Blake Sutherland and Captain Ian McAllister, both men staring at the floor with the focused intensity of people trying to become invisible, refusing to make eye contact with anyone in the room. They had the appearance of men who had suddenly realized they were standing on ice that was actively cracking beneath their feet, with deep, cold water waiting below. The room fell into absolute silence as Admiral Vance entered through a side door and moved with unhurried dignity to the elevated position at the front of the theater. He did not rush. He did not acknowledge the assembled crowd with any gesture or expression. He simply took his position behind a simple podium, opened a folder before him with careful deliberation, and began without preamble or unnecessary pleasantries. We are here today to address a profound failure of leadership and character that has implications far beyond the individuals directly involved. His voice carried through the theater without any electronic amplification, a testament to decades of giving orders in environments where being clearly heard meant the difference between mission success and catastrophic failure. For the past week, this base has been consumed by rumors, speculation, and false narratives surrounding incidents between two officers. We will now dispense entirely with rumor and deal exclusively and uncompromisingly in documented facts and objective evidence. He gestured with minimal movement to Captain Whitmore, who stood ready at a control console. The main screen behind Vance illuminated, showing the corridor security footage with crystal clarity. The timestamp was clearly visible in the corner. The angle provided an unobstructed view of the entire sequence of events, from initial approach to final resolution. The room watched in absolute silence as the footage played in real time. They saw Commander Kincaid reviewing her tablet, absorbed in her work. They saw General Brennan approach with his two officers in a formation that was unmistakably aggressive and intimidating. Saw them deliberately block the corridor exit in a tactical maneuver designed to trap and intimidate. Even without clear audio, the body language told a story that no one in the room could misinterpret or rationalize away. They watched Brennan invade Kincaid's personal space in a display of physical dominance that made several officers in the audience visibly uncomfortable. They watched him snatch the tablet from her hands in a gesture of pure contempt and power assertion. They watched him reach for her arm, initiating the unwanted physical contact that constituted assault. Then they watched the pivot, even knowing it was coming, even watching it for the second or third time as Vance had the footage replayed from multiple camera angles that captured different perspectives. It remained difficult to fully process. Commander Kincaid moved with liquid efficiency, redirecting Brennan's momentum with such elegant economy of motion that it appeared almost gentle. Using his own mass and aggression against him in a perfect application of defensive tactics. He fell not because he was struck, but because the fundamental physics of his own attack had been turned into a weapon against him through superior technique and tactical awareness. They watched him hit the deck with brutal finality. They watched Commander Kincaid immediately kneel beside him without hesitation, checking his vital signs, ensuring his airway was clear, rendering the kind of immediate medical response that saved lives in combat zones and demonstrated absolute professional discipline in the aftermath of violent confrontation. Gasps rippled through the audience in waves. Whispers began but were immediately and forcefully silenced by the crushing weight of what they were witnessing. This was not the story they had heard whispered in the dining facility, murmured in the barracks, discussed in carefully coded language in the passageways. This was not a hysterical female officer snapping under the accumulated pressure of operational stress. This was a consummate professional responding to physical assault with precisely measured defensive force and immediate medical responsibility. When the footage ended, Vance let the silence hold and build for a long moment, allowing the implications to fully settle into the consciousness of every person in the theater. Then he spoke again, his voice carrying the weight of institutional authority and personal conviction. That footage represents objective reality captured by security systems. What you just witnessed is what actually occurred in Corridor C7 on the evening in question. Now I will show you additional context that is equally important to understanding the full scope of this situation. The screen changed, displaying the report that Evelyn had filed with Fleet Cyber Command's secure repository. The document filled the screen, its sparse, factual language glowing in the dim theater lighting. Vance read select portions of it aloud, his voice level and deliberately paced to ensure every word registered with his audience. Subject: Breach of Military Conduct, UCMJ Article 134. Time: 14:32 Zulu. At 14:32 Zulu, during an operational briefing concerning anomalous electronic warfare signatures, Brigadier General Marcus Brennan deliberately poured a glass of ice water onto the reporting officer in the presence of Joint Operations Center staff and senior leadership. Vance paused, letting the clinical language of the report contrast with the shocking nature of the action it described. Verbatim quote from Brigadier General Brennan prior to action: "Let me cool you down, Commander. You seem a little overheated." Verbatim quote following action. There, clarity. He let those words hang in the air, the casual cruelty of them evident to everyone present. This report was filed at 14:48 Zulu, exactly 16 minutes after the incident it documents occurred. It was filed 2 full days before the corridor confrontation you just witnessed on video. Commander Kincaid did not file a formal complaint seeking redress or intervention. She did not request protection or reassignment. She did not come to me or any other senior officer seeking help or expressing concern for her safety or career. She documented the incident with legal precision and created a permanent, unalterable record in a secure system designed specifically for preserving evidence integrity. He closed the folder before him with deliberate finality and looked directly at Marcus Brennan, who seemed to shrink slightly under that gaze, despite his physical bulk and the uniform that had protected him for 3 decades. The general stared back, his face now pale beneath its tan, the reality of his situation finally penetrating the armor of his ego and institutional position. "Brigadier General Marcus Brennan," Vance began, his voice taking on the formal cadence of official judgment that would be recorded and preserved in permanent military records. "You were presented with a tactical assessment from a subject matter expert, an officer with specialized training and 8 years of experience in signals intelligence and electronic warfare operations. You disagreed with that assessment. That is your absolute right as a commander making tactical decisions. However, instead of engaging professionally with the data presented, instead of requesting additional analysis or seeking technical clarification, or initiating a productive dialogue about threat assessment methodologies, you chose to publicly humiliate the officer who presented that information to you. You deliberately poured ice water on her head in front of the entire Joint Operations Center staff, in front of junior officers who look to senior leadership as models of professional conduct, in front of admiral staff who represent the institutional authority of this command. Vance's voice did not rise in volume, but its intensity increased with each measured word. You then compounded this initial failure of leadership by initiating a systematic campaign to discredit Commander Kincaid's professional reputation through unofficial channels. When that character assassination proved insufficient to satisfy your wounded pride and reassert your dominance, you cornered her in an isolated corridor with 2 subordinate officers serving as witnesses and implicit enforcers, blocked her only avenue of egress, confiscated her government-issued equipment in a demonstration of power, and ultimately committed physical assault by attempting to grab her person without consent or justification. The room was so quiet that the ventilation system seemed loud by comparison. 200 officers sat frozen, some barely breathing, all of them understanding that they were witnessing something that would define command culture at this base for years to come. When your assault failed due to Commander Kincaid's superior training and tactical response, when you regained consciousness after she had defended herself and rendered you immediate medical care, you immediately began constructing a false narrative designed to destroy her career and protect your reputation. You filed sworn statements alleging an unprovoked attack. You conspired with your subordinate officers, Major Sutherland and Captain McAllister, to create coordinated testimony that bore no relationship whatsoever to observable reality as documented by multiple security cameras. You attempted to destroy the career and reputation of an officer whose only offenses were professional competence, technical expertise, and the moral courage to speak truth to power, even when that power sought to silence and punish her for that truth. Vance paused, his gaze sweeping across the assembled officers before returning with surgical precision to Brennan. At every single decision point in this sequence of events, you chose ego over duty. You chose personal pride over mission effectiveness. You chose arrogance over honor. You chose to protect your fragile self-image rather than serve the institution and mission you swore an oath to serve. You have disgraced your uniform, betrayed the trust placed in you by every Marine under your command, violated the fundamental principles that separate professional military service from common thuggery and bullying, and demonstrated conclusively that you lack the character, judgment, and integrity required for leadership at any level of responsibility. The words fell like hammer blows, each one precisely placed, each one carrying the weight of institutional authority and personal moral conviction. Marcus Brennan's face had progressed from pale to ashen gray. His hands, which had been gripping the edge of the table before him, slowly relaxed and fell to his sides, the fight visibly draining out of him as he finally understood with complete certainty that no amount of bluster or masculine aggression or appeal to rank would alter what was about to happen to him. You are hereby found guilty of conduct unbecoming an officer and a gentleman under Article 133 of the Uniform Code of Military Justice, of assault under Article 128, and of making false official statements under Article 107. You are relieved of your command authority effective immediately and retroactively as of this moment. You will receive a formal letter of reprimand that will be placed in your permanent service record, effectively ending any possibility of future advancement, promotion, or command responsibility at any level. You will be reassigned to an administrative staff position at the Pentagon with no operational authority or personnel supervision responsibilities, pending your mandatory retirement from military service, which will occur at the earliest date permitted by applicable regulations and which I will personally ensure is expedited to the maximum extent possible. Vance's attention shifted with deliberate precision to the two officers seated behind Brennan, both of whom seemed to be trying to physically disappear into their chairs. Major Blake Sutherland and Captain Ian McAllister will face their own separate disciplinary proceedings for their willing complicity in filing sworn false official statements, for conspiracy to obstruct justice, and for conduct unbecoming officers. Their military careers, like yours, General Brennan, are concluded as of this moment. They will never again be entrusted with positions of responsibility or authority over other service members. He let that judgment settle and solidify, watching as all three men seemed to physically diminish, as if the removal of their command authority and professional standing had somehow reduced their actual physical presence in the room. Then Vance turned his attention from them to the assembled crowd of officers who had been watching this proceeding with rapt and uncomfortable attention. Let this hearing serve as an unambiguous lesson to every single person in this theater, regardless of rank or service or length of time in uniform. Competence is not determined by the volume of your voice or the aggression of your posture. Strength is not demonstrated by bluster, physical intimidation, or the abuse of rank and position. Restraint of the kind that Commander Kincaid demonstrated throughout this entire ordeal is not weakness or timidity or lack of warrior spirit. It is the highest and most demanding form of discipline. It is the mark of a true professional who understands that violence and force are tools to be employed with absolute precision, and only when all other options have been exhausted, not default responses for those too emotionally limited or professionally inadequate to employ more sophisticated means of conflict resolution. He looked directly at Evelyn now, his expression softening microscopically, though his voice retained its formal authority and carried to every corner of the packed theater. Commander Kincaid, you are fully and completely exonerated of all allegations and restored immediately to your full duties and responsibilities with my absolute and unqualified confidence in your professional judgment, technical expertise, and strength of character. However, there is something else that this assembly needs to know and understand about Commander Kincaid's conduct throughout this situation. Vance gestured, and the screen changed again. This time it displayed an operational after-action report classified secret, but now being shown to the room under the Admiral's direct authority as commanding officer of the base. The electronic warfare signatures that Commander Kincaid identified in Grid Square 79er during the operational briefing that preceded the first assault against her, the technical analysis that General Brennan dismissed with contempt as shadow chasing, and the overreaction of an overcautious analyst, the professional assessment that precipitated his decision to publicly humiliate her in the operations center, that analysis proved to be completely and precisely accurate in every material detail. He paused deliberately, allowing anticipation to build before delivering the full impact of what came next. Acting on Commander Kincaid's intelligence assessment and the specific geographic coordinates and threat timelines she provided, a special operations team located and successfully neutralized a concealed mobile anti-ship missile battery consisting of 4 truck-mounted launch platforms. That battery was in the final stages of preparation to launch a coordinated attack against the carrier strike group USS Theodore Roosevelt, which was operating in international waters with a crew complement of over 5,000 sailors. The magnitude of that statement created a visible wave of reaction through the assembled officers. Whispers began but were quickly and forcefully silenced by Vance's raised hand and commanding presence. Conservative casualty estimates prepared by operational planning staff had the missile attack succeeded in striking the Roosevelt exceeded 2,000 personnel killed or critically wounded, with the potential for complete loss of the vessel depending on which compartments were struck and whether secondary explosions in magazines or aviation fuel storage could be contained. Commander Kincaid's analysis, the professional assessment that General Brennan dismissed as meaningless noise, requiring no action or further investigation, directly saved those lives through her technical expertise, professional judgment, and moral courage to present an assessment she knew would be unpopular with command leadership. The room erupted in a low murmur of shock and belated understanding that was quickly silenced by the Admiral's presence and the gravity of what was being revealed. So let us be absolutely and unambiguously clear about the complete sequence of events we are examining today. Commander Kincaid identified a genuine, lethal, time-critical threat to thousands of American lives through expert analysis of complex technical data. She was publicly humiliated and assaulted for presenting that life-saving assessment. She documented that assault without complaint or emotional display or request for intervention. She continued to perform her professional duties with absolute competence despite ongoing harassment and a systematic campaign to destroy her reputation and career. When physically assaulted again days later, she defended herself with exactly the amount of force necessary to neutralize the immediate threat, and not 1 single degree more than required, despite having full legal and moral justification under military law and rules of engagement to use far more severe force. She then immediately rendered medical aid to the person who had just assaulted her, ensuring he received appropriate care. She secured the incident site and ensured proper investigative procedures were followed. Every single action she took throughout this entire sequence of events, from the initial intelligence analysis to the final medical response after defending herself from assault, represents the standard of professional excellence, technical competence, moral courage, and strength of character to which every officer in this room should aspire, and against which we should measure our own conduct. Vance stood fully upright, the motion signaling that the formal hearing portion was concluded and judgment had been rendered. Commander Kincaid's conduct over the past week has provided a necessary and valuable course correction for the culture and standards of this command. We will learn from her example and integrate those lessons into how we lead, how we evaluate each other, and how we respond to challenges and conflicts. Or we will be replaced by those who can and will learn those lessons. As Admiral Vance prepared to leave the podium and formally dismiss the assembly, something remarkable and completely unprecedented occurred. It began in the back rows of the theater, in the section where the most junior officers typically sat during mandatory gatherings. A young Marine lieutenant, a man who had been physically present in the operations center as a watch officer when the water incident occurred, suddenly rose to his feet. He came to rigid attention, his movements sharp and parade ground precise. Then, in a gesture that was not required by any regulation or protocol or military custom, he turned to face Commander Evelyn Kincaid, and he saluted her. It was a slow, deliberate salute, held with perfect form and obvious intention. It was not part of any formal ceremony. It was not dictated by any procedure or regulation. It was a spontaneous, personal gesture of profound respect and recognition, an acknowledgement that transcended normal military hierarchy and conventional expressions of regard between officers. Then another officer stood in a different section of the theater. A Navy ensign, barely 6 months removed from commissioning at the academy, still learning what it meant to be a naval officer. She turned toward Commander Kincaid and rendered the same slow, deliberate salute. Then a Marine captain with combat deployment ribbons on his chest stood and saluted. Then a Navy lieutenant, then a more senior Marine major. Like a wave spreading across still water after a stone has been dropped at its center, officers throughout the entire theater rose to their feet in an accelerating cascade of recognition. They turned toward Commander Kincaid, and they saluted with a unity of purpose and sincerity of respect that seemed to momentarily dissolve all the normal barriers of rank and service branch and personal ambition. Within 30 seconds, every single officer in the room was standing at attention. 200 right hands raised in perfect, synchronized tribute. Sailors and Marines side by side, junior officers and senior commanders, all rendering the same gesture of profound respect and recognition. It was silent except for the rustle of uniforms and the quiet sound of 200 people breathing in unison. It was powerful beyond anything that words or formal ceremony could have conveyed. It was utterly without precedent in anyone's experience or memory of military proceedings. It was an apology delivered by an institution that rarely acknowledged its capacity for injustice or error. It was recognition delivered by peers who understood, perhaps for the first time in their careers, what actual professional excellence and moral courage look like when tested by extreme adversity. It was a collective acknowledgement that they had all failed to see what was happening, had all contributed through their silence or their gossip or their assumptions to the injustice that had been perpetrated against one of their own. Commander Evelyn Kincaid stood slowly and deliberately, her movements controlled and precise as they always were. Her face, even now in this moment of institutional recognition and personal vindication, betrayed no visible emotion. No tears, no smile of satisfaction or relief, just the same composed, professional demeanor she had maintained throughout the entire ordeal. But something subtle in her eyes, something in the way she held herself as she came to attention, suggested that she understood fully the significance and sincerity of what was occurring around her. She returned a single, crisp salute to the entire assembled room, her arm moving with perfect precision to the proper position and angle. She held that salute for a long moment, longer than regulation required, her gaze sweeping deliberately across the assembled officers, meeting eyes, acknowledging the gesture they were offering her. It was a moment of connection that transcended normal military formality, a mutual recognition of shared values and renewed commitment to the principles that were supposed to govern their profession. Then she dropped her hand with the same precision she brought to every action, executed a textbook about face that would have satisfied the most demanding drill instructor, and walked out of the theater with measured, unhurried steps. Her footsteps were the only sound in the vast space, as 200 officers remained frozen at attention, continuing to hold their salutes even as she departed, maintaining that gesture of respect until she had completely exited through the rear door and the sound of her footsteps had faded into silence. Even after she was gone, the assembled officers remained standing for several seconds longer, the weight and significance of what they had witnessed still settling upon them like snow accumulating on a landscape, transforming its appearance and character. Admiral Vance watched this entire sequence without intervention or comment, understanding that what was happening was more powerful and meaningful than anything he could have orchestrated or commanded. Finally, he spoke one word: dismissed. The theater slowly emptied over the following minutes, officers filing out in small groups, their conversations notably subdued and thoughtful, rather than the usual casual banter that followed mandatory formations. The base would never be quite the same after this day. A lesson had been delivered in the most direct and unambiguous possible way, and the culture of the command had shifted in a manner that would echo and reverberate through future decisions, future interactions between officers, future crises and challenges to institutional integrity. That evening, as the sun descended toward the horizon and painted the base in shades of amber and gold, as the operational tempo shifted from day to night watch rotations and the base settled into its nocturnal rhythm, Commander Evelyn Kincaid made her way across the now familiar path to the Naval Special Warfare Dive Training Facility. The building was quiet at this hour, most personnel having secured their equipment and departed for evening meals or rest. Only the essential duty personnel remained, maintaining systems and ensuring readiness for the next training cycle or emergency requirement. Master Chief Robert Drummond was in the main equipment bay, performing his endless routine of maintenance on the specialized gear that kept swimmers and divers alive in hostile underwater environments. His weathered hands moved with the practiced confidence and economy of motion that came from having serviced such equipment thousands of times over 3 decades, in circumstances ranging from peaceful training facilities like this one to hostile insertion zones where equipment failure meant capture, interrogation, or death. He looked up as Evelyn entered, his weathered face showing no surprise whatsoever at her presence at this hour. He had known with absolute certainty that she would come here eventually, probably today. This facility had become her sanctuary over the months she had been assigned to this base, the place where she could exist without the constant weight and pressure of other people's expectations, judgments, assumptions, and demands. She moved to the adjacent workbench without greeting or preamble and began her own maintenance routine, checking dive computers, methodically inspecting regulators for wear or contamination, performing tasks that required no conversation or social performance, but provided the deep comfort of purposeful, skilled work with concrete objectives and measurable standards. They worked side by side in comfortable silence for several minutes, the only sounds in the facility the soft, metallic clink of precision tools against equipment, and the distant, steady hum of the massive filtration pumps that kept the training pool clean and maintained at proper temperature. Then Chief Drummond reached into a nearby equipment locker and withdrew something small, carefully wrapped in plain cloth. He slid it across the workbench toward Evelyn without looking directly at her, continuing his work on the rebreather components spread before him, as if the gesture was of no particular significance or formality. It was an embroidered patch, roughly 3 inches in diameter, and clearly crafted with exceptional attention to detail. The background was pure black, and in the center was a stylized phoenix rendered in silver and gold thread. The craftsmanship was extraordinary, each individual feather detailed with precision, the bird's wings spread wide in a posture that suggested both flight and rebirth from destruction. Around the circumference of the circular patch, words were stitched in silver thread that caught and reflected the overhead lighting. Fides inter strepitus. Faith amidst the static. It was a deliberate variation and evolution of her old unit motto from Phoenix Squadron, the elite signals intelligence and cyber warfare group where she had spent 8 formative years of her career before rotating to this forward operating base. The original motto had been Fides in Tenebris, faith in darkness. This new version acknowledged and refined that concept. Darkness was not the primary operational challenge for someone in her specialty. The real challenge, the constant battle, was finding genuine signal amid overwhelming noise, identifying truth in a cacophony of competing falsehoods and deliberately planted disinformation, maintaining clarity when everything around you was static and confusion designed to obscure reality. Admiral thought your old unit motto was getting a bit outdated for what you actually do in the modern information environment. Chief Drummond rumbled without looking up from his methodical work, his voice carrying its usual low, gravelly quality. Figured this version was more accurate for the kind of warfare you're actually conducting. Darkness is easy compared to static. Any fool can operate in darkness with the right equipment. Operating in static requires something else entirely. Evelyn picked up the patch with care, running her thumbs slowly over the intricate stitching, feeling the raised texture of the silver and gold thread against the black background. The phoenix was an ancient symbol with meanings that stretched across cultures and millennia, representing death and resurrection, destruction and rebirth, the eternal cycle of ending and beginning. It was profoundly appropriate for what she had just endured and survived. She had been professionally killed by Marcus Brennan's actions, her reputation systematically destroyed through public humiliation and coordinated character assassination. And she had risen from those ashes, not through revenge or political maneuvering or pulling strings with powerful allies, but through the simple, disciplined expedient of being correct in her assessments and documenting everything with legal precision. The patch was more than decorative recognition or a token gift. It was an institutional statement that the system, for all its deep flaws and ingrained biases and tremendous capacity for injustice when operated by those with bad faith or weak character, could occasionally, and importantly, correct itself when presented with sufficient evidence and when leaders with integrity were willing to act on that evidence, regardless of the personal or political cost of doing so. It was an acknowledgement that she had navigated a system explicitly designed to favor and protect men like Marcus Brennan, had faced every obstacle and challenge that system could throw at her, and had emerged not just intact, but vindicated and strengthened. She nodded once, a minimal gesture of acknowledgement and thanks that nonetheless contained more depth and genuine emotion than an elaborate speech could have expressed. She slipped the patch carefully into her pocket, feeling its small but solid weight against her palm through the fabric. The restoration was complete in every way that mattered. The system had processed the data she provided, identified the error in its operation, and implemented appropriate corrective action. The door to the facility hissed open with a soft, pneumatic sound, and Captain Theodore Whitmore entered carrying a government-issued tablet, the ubiquitous tool of modern military communication and information distribution. He approached the workbench where Evelyn and Chief Drummond continued their equipment maintenance, his expression carrying the particular seriousness and focus that preceded new operational tasking or significant mission assignments. "Evelyn," he said, using her first name as he typically did when they were not in formal command settings or in the presence of others who might object to such informality between officers of different ranks. "New tasking just came through from Fleet Cyber Command. High priority. They're requesting you specifically by name for something they're describing as time critical and requiring your particular expertise with polymorphic signal analysis." Evelyn looked up from her equipment maintenance work, her eyes already shifting seamlessly into the intensely focused analytical mode that she brought to intelligence problems and operational challenges. The events of the past week were already being mentally filed away in her consciousness, categorized as complete and resolved, archived as a data point and learning experience in what would hopefully be a long and continuing career. The past was past, immutable, and no longer requiring active attention or emotional processing. The present was operational and demanded focus. The future was loading with new challenges and requirements. She took the tablet from Whitmore with steady hands, her gaze immediately beginning to scan the preliminary intelligence brief displayed on the screen. It was heavily redacted even at her considerable security clearance level, which strongly suggested significant sensitivity and probable involvement of national-level intelligence assets and strategic implications. She caught fragmentary keywords and phrases as she scrolled. Distributed network intrusion, state-level actor with significant technical capabilities, polymorphic encryption schemes, critical infrastructure targeting, potential timeline measured in days rather than weeks. It was precisely the kind of complex, technically demanding problem that her particular combination of skills, experience, and analytical approach was specifically designed to address and resolve. "Understood," she said simply, her voice carrying the same level, professional tone it always did. No excitement, no satisfaction at being specifically requested, just acknowledgement of new mission requirements, an implicit commitment to meeting those requirements with the same standard of excellence she brought to every task. Whitmore hesitated for a moment, something he rarely did in his role as Admiral Vance's primary aide and communication channel. When he spoke again, his voice carried a weight and sincerity that suggested he was speaking not just for himself, but attempting to articulate something that many others felt but might not have the opportunity or courage to express directly. "What you did this week, Evelyn, the way you handled everything that was thrown at you, every challenge and injustice and attempt to break you or drive you out, it mattered. Not just for you personally, though obviously you bore the brunt of it and the victory is rightfully yours, but it mattered for everyone on this base. Everyone who watched what happened and how you responded and how the system ultimately worked when presented with clear evidence and principled leadership. You showed people what professional excellence actually looks like when it's tested by extreme adversity. You showed them what moral courage means when there's actual cost and risk involved, not just when it's easy or convenient or popular. That matters more than you might realize." Evelyn's eyes didn't leave the tablet screen as she continued scrolling through the intelligence summary and threat assessment, her mind already beginning to construct analytical frameworks and methodological approaches for addressing the technical challenge described in the brief. She absorbed details about network architecture, attack vectors, defensive measures that had already failed, timeline constraints, potential consequences of failure. Every system has protocols and mechanisms for self-correction built into its fundamental design, she replied after a moment of consideration, her response characteristically framing a profoundly human situation in technical, procedural language, reducing complex social and institutional dynamics to system analysis and process optimization. This particular system simply required activation of those correction mechanisms through provision of proper inputs and evidence. The outcome was predictable once sufficient data was presented to decision-makers operating in good faith. It was a perfectly Evelyn response, typical of her way of processing and communicating about the world. Whitmore smiled slightly, despite the seriousness of the operational discussion, shook his head with a mixture of admiration and mild exasperation at her unshakable tendency to view everything through technical and procedural frameworks, and left her to begin her detailed review of the new intelligence requirements. Chief Drummond continued his maintenance work at the adjacent bench, but he was smiling too, a subtle expression of deep satisfaction that creased his weathered face in ways that made him look slightly less intimidating than usual. He had seen countless officers pass through his facility over 30 years of military service spanning peace and war, training, and actual combat operations. He had watched many of them break or compromise under pressures far less severe than what Evelyn had endured this week. He had watched others slowly adapt their principles and standards to fit institutional reality, gradually becoming the very thing they had once opposed or sworn to resist. He had never in 3 decades seen anyone quite like Commander Evelyn Kincaid. She had faced coordinated institutional bias, public humiliation designed to break her spirit, physical assault, false accusations that could have ended her career and resulted in criminal charges, and systematic attempts to destroy her professional reputation. And she had not bent even slightly. She had not become bitter or cynical about the institution she served. She had simply documented with precision, responded with exactly appropriate force when physically attacked, and waited patiently for the system to process the evidence she had meticulously provided. And against odds that seemed impossibly long, against assumptions and biases that seemed insurmountable, the system had corrected itself. Justice, imperfect and delayed, but genuine and meaningful, had been served. The truth had emerged despite determined efforts to suppress and distort it. Over the following days and weeks, subtle but significant and lasting changes rippled outward through Forward Operating Base Archangel, like waves propagating from a disturbance at the center of still water. The atmosphere in the Joint Operations Center shifted noticeably. Officers at all levels spoke more carefully and thoughtfully, consciously considering their words and tone before dismissing or challenging the technical assessments of subordinates or specialists. The loud, domineering, aggressively masculine command style that Marcus Brennan had exemplified and that many had unconsciously emulated fell dramatically out of favor, replaced gradually by a quieter, more analytical and collaborative approach that genuinely valued data and expertise over volume and intimidation. Junior officers throughout the base, and particularly female officers who had watched Commander Kincaid's ordeal with a mixture of horror and resigned acceptance, noticed the change most acutely and personally. They had observed her systematic humiliation and the coordinated attempts to destroy her career, with the uncomfortable recognition that similar treatment could easily be directed at any of them if they challenged the wrong person or made the wrong enemy. Many of them had accepted such treatment as simply an unavoidable cost of serving in a male-dominated institution, where women would always be viewed with some degree of suspicion and their competence always subject to question. The complete vindication, the public exoneration, the spontaneous mass salute in the theater had communicated something profound and transformative that went far beyond the specific case. That competence in discipline, properly documented and courageously defended, could ultimately triumph over institutional bias and political maneuvering. The system was not perfect, remained deeply flawed in many ways, but it could be made to work correctly if one had the courage and patience and skill to operate it according to its own stated principles, rather than accepting its frequent failures as inevitable. In the dining facility, Commander Kincaid no longer ate alone in isolated silence. Officers who had previously avoided her table or pretended not to see her now actively sought opportunities to sit near her, not in any obvious or obsequious attempt to curry favor or be associated with her victory, but out of genuine respect and curiosity about her perspective and approach. Conversations that would have been strained or awkward just days earlier now flowed naturally. She was no longer the commander who got humiliated in the collective consciousness of the base. She was the commander who had identified a critical threat that saved thousands of lives, who had handled institutional injustice with absolute professionalism, and who had demonstrated what actual strength looked like when tested by adversity. Admiral Vance made a deliberate point of personally attending a routine intelligence briefing 3 days after the hearing, something that was not at all standard practice for the base commander. His presence sent an unmistakable signal about the value he placed on the intelligence function and on Commander Kincaid's work specifically. When Evelyn presented her updated analysis of emerging electronic warfare patterns across the region and potential indicators of hostile intent, every officer in that briefing room listened with complete and focused attention. No one interrupted with dismissive comments. No one challenged her methodology without solid technical justification. No one dismissed her assessments as shadow chasing or overcautious analysis. When she finished her presentation, Vance simply nodded with evident satisfaction and said in his characteristically understated way, "Excellent work, Commander. Ensure this analysis is distributed immediately to all relevant operational units across the theater." It was a simple, professional exchange that lasted perhaps 30 seconds, but it represented and symbolized complete restoration of her professional standing. A public demonstration witnessed by dozens of officers that her expertise was valued, her judgment was trusted, and her place in the command structure was not just secure, but enhanced by how she had handled the challenges thrown at her. Marcus Brennan departed Forward Operating Base Archangel 4 days after the hearing, his exit as ignominious as his command had been toxic. There was no ceremony, no formal farewell gathering, no formation of officers assembled to wish him well in his next assignment, as military tradition typically dictated for departing senior officers. He simply loaded his personal effects into a transport vehicle in the pre-dawn darkness, was driven to the airfield, and departed on the first available flight to the United States. His career, which had spanned 3 decades and included multiple combat deployments and steady advancement through the ranks, was effectively over in every meaningful sense. He would serve out his remaining obligated time in an administrative staff position so far removed from operational command and so devoid of actual authority that he might as well have already been retired. He would never again lead Marines or any other service members. He would never again hold position or authority or command the respect that he had taken for granted throughout his adult life. Major Blake Sutherland and Captain Ian McAllister received their own letters of reprimand and were reassigned to different bases on opposite coasts, their careers permanently stalled at their current ranks with no possibility of future advancement or positions of responsibility. They would never be trusted again with authority over other service members, would never be given assignments requiring integrity or independent judgment. The Marine Corps had a very long institutional memory for officers who filed false sworn statements and conspired to obstruct justice, and that memory would follow them for whatever remained of their careers. On the 10th day after the hearing, as the base continued settling into its new patterns and rhythms, and the incident began its gradual transition from immediate current event to institutional cautionary tale that would be referenced in leadership training for years, Commander Evelyn Kincaid stood once more in the dive training facility in the quiet hours of late evening. Most personnel had secured for the night, returned to their quarters for rest, or whatever personal activities filled their off-duty hours. She was preparing methodically for a training dive, checking her equipment with the same ritual focus and attention to detail that such preparations always required and always received from her regardless of circumstances. Master Chief Drummond was nearby, as he often was during these hours, performing his own maintenance tasks, but available if she needed anything or simply wanted company. He had become something of an unofficial guardian presence, not because Evelyn needed protection or assistance, but because he respected her enough to ensure she had space to work and think without unwanted interference or intrusion. She had carefully sewn the Phoenix patch onto her flight suit, the specialized uniform she wore for technical operations and field deployments. The silver and gold thread caught and reflected the overhead lighting as she moved, a small but visible declaration of identity and purpose and hard-won recognition. Fides inter strepitus, faith amidst the static. It was not merely decorative or symbolic. It was operational philosophy and methodology encoded in Latin and embroidered thread. "You know," Chief Drummond said after a period of comfortable silence, breaking his usual pattern of letting her work without conversation, "there are a lot of junior officers around this base watching you very closely now, trying to understand how you did it, how you went through that entire week of hell without breaking, without compromising, without becoming bitter or cynical or giving up on the system entirely. They're trying to figure out if there's something they can learn, something they can replicate if they ever face similar challenges. Evelyn paused in her equipment check, giving his observation the consideration it deserved, rather than dismissing it reflexively. "They're asking the wrong question," she said finally with characteristic precision. "Survival implies passivity, endurance without agency. I didn't survive what happened. I executed a procedure. There's a fundamental difference." "And what procedure was that?" Chief Drummond asked with genuine curiosity, wanting to hear her articulate what he suspected but couldn't quite put into precise words himself. "Documentation with legal precision, evidence gathering and preservation, patience and discipline while the system processes provided inputs." She resumed her equipment work, her hands moving with practiced efficiency as she spoke. "Most people, when confronted with aggression or injustice or abuse of authority, respond primarily with emotion, anger, fear, the desire for immediate retaliation or escape. Emotion is noise in the signal processing sense. It corrupts the data. It introduces bias and error into analysis and decision-making." She continued checking pressure gauges and valve seals as she explained her methodology. "I documented the pattern of behavior with precision. I established unbreakable chain of custody for evidence. I allowed the system to process the data I provided according to its own stated rules and procedures. The military justice system is deeply flawed in many ways, designed originally by and for a specific demographic that doesn't include me. But it's functional when operated correctly and when decision-makers act in good faith on clear evidence. It simply requires correct inputs, formatted appropriately." Chief Drummond nodded slowly, beginning to understand not just what she had done, but how she had conceptualized the entire experience from the beginning. "You make it sound simple when you describe it that way." "It is simple, conceptually," Evelyn replied without hesitation. "It's just not easy in execution. There's a critical difference." She finished her equipment check and looked toward the dive tank, that familiar rectangle of clear blue water that represented sanctuary and clarity and the application of absolute physical laws that cared nothing for rank or politics or human weakness. "The difficult part, the part that most people can't maintain, is preserving discipline and executing procedure when everything in your evolutionary biology, everything in your social conditioning, everything in your emotional system is screaming at you to respond immediately with equivalent force, or to seek protection from allies, or to engage in the political warfare and coalition building that most people instinctively understand and rely on." She picked up her rebreather, feeling its familiar weight settle into her hands with the comfort of proven, reliable equipment. "But emotion is a luxury that degrades performance. Politics is fundamentally unstable and depends on factors outside your control. Evidence and procedure are eternal and reliable if you understand how to use them correctly. I chose the difficult path with full awareness of what I was choosing, because it was the only path that led with high probability to the correct outcome in the long term." Chief Drummond was quiet for a long moment, absorbing her words and the worldview they revealed. Then he said something he had been wanting to tell her since the hearing. "You know what some of the junior officers have started calling you? Not officially, not where you'd hear it normally, but in their private conversations when they think senior enlisted aren't listening?" Evelyn raised an eyebrow fractionally, the closest she typically came to expressing curiosity or surprise about social dynamics and interpersonal perceptions. "The signal," Chief Drummond said with evident satisfaction and approval. "They're calling you the signal because you cut through all the noise and static and bullshit in politics and get to what's actually true and important. Every single time, regardless of cost or convenience or what powerful people want the truth to be. You're the signal in a world full of noise." Evelyn considered this designation for a moment, testing it against her self-conception and professional identity. Then she nodded once with what might have been the faintest suggestion of approval. It was accurate. It was appropriate in multiple senses. She was comfortable with it as a description of her function and approach. She entered the dive tank without further comment, descending gradually into that blue silence that required no words, no social performance, no navigation of complex interpersonal dynamics and institutional politics. Down here in this suspended world, there was only physics and procedure and the absolute reliability of natural laws. Down here, the noise of the world above faded into complete irrelevance, leaving only the essential signal of her own breathing and heartbeat and the data her senses provided about pressure and temperature and spatial orientation. As she settled into her meditation position on the bottom of the tank, her breathing steady and controlled through the rebreather, her mind already beginning to shift focus toward the new intelligence tasking that awaited her, she felt a profound sense of equilibrium that had been temporarily disrupted and was now completely restored. The correction was achieved. The system had processed the data, identified the operational error, and implemented appropriate remediation. Balance was restored, not through revenge or triumph, but through the proper functioning of institutional mechanisms that existed for exactly this purpose. Marcus Brennan had looked at her and seen a woman, made assumptions rooted in bias about weakness and emotional instability and unsuitability for operational command. He had observed her silence and professional restraint and interpreted those qualities as fear and passivity. He had believed with absolute confidence that his rank and physical presence and masculine aggression were sufficient to dominate and control any situation or challenge to his authority. He had been catastrophically wrong on every single count, and that wrongness had cost him literally everything that defined his identity and gave his life meaning and structure. Evelyn had observed a pattern of behavior, documented it with legal and technical precision, and responded to escalating provocation and eventually physical assault with exactly calibrated defensive force that was both effective and legally defensible. She had trusted the process and maintained her discipline even when the process seemed to be failing, even when institutional momentum appeared to favor her attacker, even when easier paths of compromise or resignation or emotional breakdown must have seemed tempting. She had maintained absolute faith in evidence and procedure, even in darkness. And in the end, inevitably, the signal had emerged from the static. Clear, undeniable, true. Far above her, beyond the confines of the dive tank, beyond the walls of the training facility, beyond the perimeter of Forward Operating Base Archangel, the vast machinery of military operations and global strategic competition continued its inexorable function. Personnel stood their watches through the night. Aircraft were maintained and prepared for the next day's operations. Intelligence was continuously analyzed for patterns and threats. Decisions with life and death consequences were made by people trying their best with incomplete information and limited time. The mission continued as it always had and always would, indifferent to individual triumphs and tragedies, demanding constant vigilance and professional excellence from those who had volunteered to serve. But something had changed in one small part of that vast machine. A lesson had been learned and internalized by hundreds of officers who would carry it forward through the rest of their careers. A standard had been established and demonstrated through personal example rather than abstract policy statements. And that standard bore her name, her methodology, her absolutely unwavering commitment to evidence over emotion, procedure over politics, signal over noise, regardless of personal cost. She had become more than an individual officer with specific technical expertise. She had become a reference point, a proof of concept, a living demonstration that the system could work correctly when operated with integrity and courage. Not easily, not without significant personal cost and sacrifice, but correctly in accordance with its own stated principles and values. Her hand rested on the phoenix patch attached to her equipment, feeling through her glove the raised texture of the embroidered thread. Fides inter strepitus, faith amidst the static. It was not just a motto or symbolic phrase. It was methodology and operational philosophy. It was a way of existing and operating in a world that constantly and deliberately confused volume with substance, aggression with strength, emotional performance with authenticity. She had demonstrated another way, quieter, harder, more demanding of discipline and patience, and absolute confidence in your own judgment, but more effective, more reliable, more aligned with the principles that were supposed to govern professional military service and separate it from mere organized violence. The next generation of officers would remember what they had witnessed. Some would attempt to emulate her approach and methodology. Most would fail, lacking the particular and rare combination of technical brilliance, emotional discipline, absolute patience, and unwavering confidence required to maintain that approach under extreme pressure and adversity. But some would succeed, and each success would further entrench and validate the principle that competence, properly documented and courageously defended against institutional resistance, would ultimately prevail over bias and political maneuvering and abuse of authority. It was not a revolution that overturned existing structures and imposed new ones through force. It was a correction that worked within the system, that proved the system contained mechanisms for its own improvement and self-correction if those mechanisms were properly activated with correct inputs. Sometimes corrections were more powerful and lasting than revolutions precisely because they demonstrated that dramatic upheaval was unnecessary, that the existing system could function properly if operated with integrity and courage. She simply had to maintain absolute faith that those correction mechanisms existed and could be activated, even in institutional darkness. Even amidst overwhelming noise and static and deliberate disinformation, especially then. Tomorrow would bring new operational challenges, new signals to identify and analyze amid increasing noise, new threats to assess and communicate to decision-makers who might or might not listen or act appropriately. New opportunities to demonstrate that quiet professional excellence was more powerful than loud mediocrity protected by rank and politics. The mission continued without pause or sentiment. It always continued. But tonight, for this suspended moment at the bottom of the dive tank in perfect blue silence, the correction was complete and verified. The system had functioned as designed when provided with proper inputs. Justice, imperfect and delayed, but real and meaningful, had been served through institutional mechanisms rather than personal revenge. She placed her hand one final time on the phoenix patch, feeling its solid, comforting presence through the fabric. Then her mind turned fully toward the intelligence brief waiting on that tablet, toward the new challenge of polymorphic encryption and state-level network intrusion, toward the analytical process that would dominate her focus for the coming days and weeks. The past was properly archived with appropriate metadata and access controls. The future was loading its next set of operational requirements, and Commander Evelyn Kincaid, the signal, was ready for whatever pattern emerged next from the chaos. She had proven what she needed to prove, to the institution, to herself, to everyone who had doubted or dismissed or underestimated her. She had demonstrated that the signal would always eventually emerge from the static if you had sufficient faith and discipline and patience to wait for the noise to clear. Always. Correction achieved.